In 1961, a researcher named Ancel Keys appeared on the cover of Time magazine. The headline was about fat, specifically the fat in eggs, butter, and whole milk, and the claim that it was killing Americans. Within 2 decades, that claim had reshaped the dietary guidelines of the United States, the United Kingdom, and most of the Western world. At almost exactly the same time, in a village on the island of Crete, a woman in her mid-40s was sitting down to her usual breakfast. 2 eggs boiled in a small pot, a piece of bread with olive oil pressed on it, sometimes a handful of greens. She had eaten this way since childhood. Her mother had eaten this way, her grandmother before that. And the project that made Keys famous was about to study her village. What the researchers found there was not what the guidelines would later suggest. The villagers had the lowest cardiovascular death rate of any population on Earth, 30 times lower than the United States. The fat they were eating every morning was not a problem. It appeared to be part of why they were still alive. This video is about what happened to that finding and why it took 40 years to resurface. The 7 countries study began in 1957. It tracked over 12,000 men across 15 population groups in 7 countries, monitoring what they ate and recording who died, and from what. It was the most ambitious dietary study of its era. In terms of scope and follow-up duration, it has never been fully replicated. The 2 healthiest populations in the study sat at opposite ends of the fat spectrum. Rural Japanese men were eating 9% of their calories from fat. Rural Cretan men were eating 37%. Both groups had dramatically lower cardiovascular mortality than the Americans and Northern Europeans in the study. The Japanese result fit the fat hypothesis cleanly. The Cretan result did not. What the Cretans were eating at breakfast specifically was not complicated. Eggs from hens that grazed on wild plants. Olive oil used as a condiment rather than a cooking fat. Bread. Greens when available. Occasionally, a small piece of cheese. The animal products they consumed came from animals eating native vegetation high in alpha-linolenic acid, which passed into the meat and eggs. The ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids in that population was approximately 2:1. The ratio in a standard Western diet today is roughly 10:1. That gap matters because omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids compete for the same conversion enzymes. When omega-6 dominates, the body produces significantly more arachidonic acid, which drives the signaling cascade behind chronic systemic inflammation. Atherosclerotic plaque, the process that precedes most cardiovascular events, is an inflammatory disease. The Cretan breakfast was not heart-healthy because it was low in something. It was heart-healthy because of where the fat came from. There was a second detail in the data that went largely unreported. The dietary surveys in Crete were conducted partly during Lent, a period when devout Orthodox Christians significantly reduced their consumption of animal products. The saturated fat figures for the Cretan cohort were almost certainly undercounted as a result. Keys noted the issue and moved past it. The official American Dietary Guidelines arrived in 1980. The message was direct: avoid too much fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. The 1977 dietary goals that preceded them had set a target of 55 to 60% of calories from carbohydrate and a ceiling of 30% from fat. The food industry did not resist this. It adapted. When fat came out of processed food, sugar and starch went in. A standard low-fat flavored yogurt today contains between 17 and 26 grams of added sugar per serving. A full-fat plain yogurt contains 4 to 6 grams of naturally occurring lactose and nothing added. The product with the low-fat claim delivers 3 to 4 times the glycemic load of the product it replaced. The label is not wrong about the fat. It simply does not mention what replaced it. Per capita added sugar consumption in the United States rose steadily across the decades that followed the guidelines. The obesity rate rose alongside it. This does not prove causation, but researchers studying the original dietary data have noted a detail that was visible in the 7 countries study all along. A 1999 reanalysis found that sugar consumption correlated more strongly with heart disease deaths across the study populations than saturated fat intake did. That reanalysis was published 29 years after the study concluded. Grandma's lard crock was not a health risk. The thing that replaced it was. In 1967, a review paper on dietary fat and heart disease appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine. It drew on existing research to argue that fat and cholesterol were the primary dietary drivers of coronary heart disease. Sugar, the paper concluded, was not a significant concern. The review became a foundational text for the low-fat consensus that followed. What was not in the paper was who paid for it. In 2016, a dentist-turned-researcher named Kristen Kearns at UC San Francisco published findings in JAMA Internal Medicine after spending years working through internal documents from industry archives. The review had been funded by the Sugar Research Foundation. The foundation had set the review's objective, contributed articles for inclusion, and received drafts before publication. The lead Harvard researcher was paid the equivalent of $50,000 in today's money. None of this was disclosed. The NEJM had no disclosure requirement until 1984, 17 years after the paper ran. The internal documents also showed that by 1954, the Sugar Research Foundation had already calculated that if Americans adopted low-fat diets, per capita sucrose consumption would increase by more than 1/3. The guidelines were financially valuable before the research supporting them was written. The same intellectual thread runs forward from there. D. Mark Hegstead, one of the Harvard researchers on that 1967 review, later helped draft the 1977 federal dietary goals that set the framework for American nutrition policy. A funded literature review and a federal document with the same author at both ends. The 1967 paper remains in the NEJM archive today without a correction attached to it. While the low-fat guidelines were being written, a researcher at the University of Minnesota named Ivan France Jr. was running what would become the largest controlled dietary fat trial in history. The Minnesota Coronary Experiment enrolled 9,423 men and women aged 20 to 97 in a double-blind, randomized controlled trial. One group ate a standard diet, including animal fats. The other replaced those fats with corn oil and corn oil margarine, which is high in linoleic acid. This was the exact dietary swap that policy was recommending. The intervention group achieved a significant reduction in serum cholesterol. Under the diet heart hypothesis, that should have meant lower cardiovascular mortality. It did not. For every 30 milligrams per deciliter that serum cholesterol dropped in the intervention group, the data showed a 22% higher risk of death. The corn oil group was not doing better. It was doing worse. The trial ended in 1973. The full results were not published. Robert France, Ivan's son, is a cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic. He drove to his childhood home 3 times before finding the original data in unlabeled cardboard boxes in the far corner of the basement. NIH researcher Christopher Ramsden reanalyzed the complete data set and published the findings in the BMJ in April 2016, 43 years after the trial concluded. William Castelli directed the Framingham Heart Study from 1979 to 1995. In a 1992 paper, he wrote that in Framingham, the more saturated fat one ate, the more cholesterol one ate, the more calories one ate, the lower the person's serum cholesterol measured. The director of the study that became synonymous with the diet heart hypothesis found within that study's own data that saturated fat intake correlated with lower measured cholesterol. That finding did not make it into the guidelines. The Cretan breakfast was not a supplement regimen. It was not optimized. It was the default food of people who had access to olive trees, chickens, and bread, and nothing more interesting to eat. The practical translation from that into a modern kitchen is narrower than most nutrition advice suggests. Extra virgin olive oil used cold as a condiment on bread or poured over food after cooking preserves oleocanthal, a compound that inhibits the same inflammatory enzymes as ibuprofen. Heating destroys it. The Cretans were doing this without knowing why it mattered. On eggs, pasture-raised hens carry between 2 and 5 times more omega-3 fatty acids than battery cage eggs because of what the animal ate. On sugar, the target before noon is below 5 grams. The average American breakfast currently delivers 26, almost entirely from products reformulated after 1980 to replace the fat that guidelines told manufacturers to remove. Check the ingredient list for sugar under its other names: cane syrup, maltodextrin, and fruit juice concentrate. That is the whole intervention. Efrosini did not read the 7 countries study. She did not know that her breakfast was, by one measure, the most studied meal in longevity science. She ate what her mother ate, in a place where there was no margarine to replace the olive oil and no guideline telling her the eggs were a problem. By the time the researchers arrived to document her village's exceptional health, the infrastructure of American dietary policy was already moving in the other direction. The low-fat era began. The food industry reformulated. The controlled trials that found harm from the swap were not published. The funding that shaped the consensus was not disclosed. When researchers finally recovered the buried data 40 years later, they found what the Cretan cohort had suggested in the late 1950s, that the relationship between dietary fat and mortality was not what the guidelines had said it was. The breakfast did not change. The interpretation of it did. One question for the comments: which part of this surprised you most? Leave your answer below. See you on the next one.